Well, Karl Marx was the greatest thinker of the 19th century. He was a revolutionary, first and foremost. He participated in the Revolution of 1848, and he and his comrade Friedrich Engels were asked by the communist group in Europe at that time, I think it was called the Communist League, to write a manifesto. He wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and he called on workers of all countries to unite and to break their chains and to build a new world. And then he was exiled to England, and there he did not participate in émigré political intrigues and controversies because of the loss of the 1848 revolution in Germany, which was a very big setback for Europe. The Russian Tsar crushed the revolution in Poland and in Austria and in Germany. And so there was a setback there, but instead he took on the historic task of analyzing what was the source of profit in capitalism. And he spent 20 years sitting on hard benches in the London Library, analyzing, as a scientist analyzes, 20 years of arduous work analyzing where capitalism draws profit from. And the result of that study is in, of course, his famous Das Kapital, the first volume of which was published in 1867, alongside, I might say, the Origin of the Species. And so these were two remarkable works of science that came out at the same time in the middle of the 19th century. And his comrade, Friedrich Engels, dissected his writings, and not dissected, but put them in order, and also published volumes 2 and 3. So we have the full 3 volumes of Das Kapital. In addition, Marx studied the Paris Commune, the first workers' government after the uprising of March 18th, 1871 in Paris. The first workers' government was established. And he concluded from that the working class had not only to seize the power, but they had to smash the old state. And he wrote very eloquently on the need for the working class and people to establish a new form of state power. And he predicted with great certainty that the rich would become richer and the poor would become poorer, and that eventually there would be great revolutionary outbreaks that would lead to a transformation of society. But he also predicted, and this is very important to note, that in a time of crisis, a society in crisis can either go forward with the rising of the oppressed class, or the society can be destroyed by the struggle between the contending classes. And so that faces us today as a problem of preventing nuclear war between the great powers. That is to say, should the people be able to stop the great powers from going into a third world war, or suffer the cataclysmic disaster that a third world war would bring on humanity.
What exactly is the difference between socialism and communism? What's the difference?
Socialism is the first stage of communism. Socialism is a preparatory stage, because when you're moving from one social order to a social order of a much higher and complex level, it takes several generations. And socialism is a society defined as from each according to their ability, to each according to their work. And so that means that people contribute to the society, and the individuals, actually socialism is society, believe it or not, where the real differences between individual human beings come into play economically, because the contributions are differentiated. But it's the precursor, it's the building the foundations for a new society wherein we move from what he called the kingdom of necessity to the realm of freedom. And this is where all society is harmonized, all class differences are eliminated, and the working class, he predicted, the modern proletariat, the factory proletariat that was created in the 19th century by the Industrial Revolution, would be the social force in modern society that eliminated itself. Eliminate itself. That was its aim. Eliminate itself as a class. Eliminate all classes. So that humanity and nature could be harmonized, and a really humane, human-centered society, which we can hardly imagine really, could be built on planet Earth. And that was his great vision, and yet to my mind it's still a great inspiration to people, because how will we save Mother Earth? How will we save humanity if we don't eliminate this terrible greed represented by corporate monopoly capitalism of our day, and imperialism and war? So Karl Marx had a very definite notion of society moving first from socialism, the seizure of state power. He was the one who proclaimed the necessity for the dictatorship of the proletariat and for becoming the nation. He was very strict about that. In his notion, in the manifesto, he said the working class must become the nation. They must assert themselves as the nation, i.e. they must become the nation builders, but in a new way, without exploitation of one person by another person. And that's the first stage, socialism.
What do you make of the democratic socialism which Bernie Sanders is advocating for in the United States presently?
Well, it's a form of what we call social democracy. Bernie Sanders basically accepts the framework of modern capitalism and imperialism, especially imperialism. It's for the foreign relations of the United States to seek world power. But Bernie Sanders raises some very important issues of restricting the monopolies, as I understand it, and I'm no authority on Bernie Sanders, I have to tell you that right off, but as I understand him, he would like to impose some very important social democratic restrictions on monopoly capitalism, and I think that's not unimportant. I think that's good that a lot of people want to hear the word socialism without being caught up in Cold War hatred toward the very concept of socialism. And so I think his politics have played a role. I still think, however, the United States of America needs to free itself from the complex of anti-communism, and needs, especially because the whole world really is, in a sense, I don't like to say this exactly this way, but in a sense is waiting upon the working class of the United States of America to mature, to acquire the theory necessary to lead their society out of a really kind of barbaric and very inhumane society. The United States of America is really a very inhumane, violent, cruel, mean society. Highest prison rates, racist to the core, violence abroad, violence for everything, making macho violence, a feature of their culture. How to get beyond that, There's not, and also the question of women, very, very violent and sexist toward women, and putting women down and putting national minorities down, and Islamophobia. Oh God, we could go on and on. But it has great potential, and it has great possibilities, and in fact, it has great international responsibilities. We who live in Canada and are very like the United States of America, they are our cousins, so to speak, and so we need to encourage them to take up the positive, the positive politics of Bernie Sanders, but also to create their own Marxist-Leninist party and movement. So Lenin was alive when Lenin was a young adult when Engels died in 1898. Engels died at a time when Europe was arming to the teeth. And Engels wrote warning the Second International, which had been formed around the 1880s sometime, the various socialist parties, that watch out, Europe is heading for war, and it's going to be a war of an entirely different kind, because in 1898, all the big powers were arming to the teeth. They had divided Africa in 1885 at the Congress of Berlin. Lenin matured as a revolutionary in the course of the struggle against Russian medievalism. Now you have to bear in mind, Lenin's brother his brother, I think younger brother, was an anarchist, and he was implicated in a plot to blow up the Tsar, and he was hanged for that. And Lenin was strongly against all acts of anarchism and terrorism. So he took up Marxist politics, and he strongly believed that the only social force in Russia that was capable of leading the mass of the persons in Russia who were peasants in agriculture, enslaved to a semi-medieval kind of form of agriculture, the only social force in Russia was the new modern industrial proletariat in the big cities, the factory proletariat. Capitalism was coming to Russia at that time, industrialism was growing, and Lenin fought very hard to create a professional Marxist party, professional party. And the key thing he said about that party was each person who was a member of it needed to be in a basic organization, and they had to apply party rules on each and every member. You could not be a group of aristocratic intellectuals, as he called them, who could do whatever they pleased and say whatever they pleased on it. He said, no, we need a party. It has to have a centralized leadership. It has to have its own journals. It needs professional revolutionaries who are linked to the working class. Now, we're talking about a country that was medieval, semi-medieval at least, and capitalism was just growing in it, backward country, and so the historic task for Russia was to free the peasantry and build socialism. But Lenin was very aware that it was possible to create socialism because Russia was such a big country. He hinted at the possibilities right up to the First World War that socialism could be built in Tsarist Russia, the Russian Empire. And he concluded that in 1915, during the First World War. Now, it's very important to acknowledge this fact about Lenin. His Bolshevik Party, founded in 1902 or 1903 at the First Congress in London, they were the only party to remain true to the 1912 resolution of the Second Socialist International that the socialist parties should revolt against any war that the European imperialists should impose on the working class of Europe. And they took a very strong stand on that. But when push came to shove in 1914, guess what happened? All the socialist parties collapsed. They all said, oh, no, we have to defend our nation, we have to defend our governments because it was the other guys that were the bad guys, and so on. And Lord, knows what happened. It was a travesty. It was a huge disaster for the working class of Europe. They were massacring each other on a chauvinist basis, on the basis that our capitalists are better than their capitalists, that sort of thing. Lenin's party was the only party in 1914 that voted against war credits. They were in the Duma. They had, I think, 12 deputies there, not very many, just a handful, 12 of them. And they were all arrested and shipped off to Siberia. But Lenin stood firm. And in 1915, he wrote this book, Imperialism, the Last Stage of Capitalism. And he described it as parasitic capitalism, monopoly capitalism, dying capitalism. And he said, this is the era of proletarian revolution. And this is the period when war, imperialist war, can only be ended by the rising of the proletariat against these imperialist countries and the establishment of peaceful socialist governments. And so Lenin and the Bolshevik Party did exactly that. When the opportunities arose through a lot of struggle, a lot of class struggle, a lot of sacrifice, in 1917, first the February Revolution, overthrew the Tsar, they set up a republic, and Lenin gave the call when he came back from Switzerland, his great thesis about his so-called April thesis, in which he said Russia must move from a bourgeois democratic revolution to a socialist revolution. And the opportunity came because the so-called bourgeois democratic government of Petrograd waged a summer offensive in July against the Germans at the dictate of the bankers of France and England. And of course it was a disaster. And the Bolsheviks were the only political force in Russia that said, no, we want an end to the war against Germany. We want peace, land, and bread. That was their slogan. And so when the all-Soviet meetings were called in November 7th by our calendar, October 25th by the old Russian calendar, Lenin had a social force, the sailors in Petrograd, the sailors of the Baltic Fleet, and the workers of Petrograd, and they said, this is the day we need an insurrection, and they organized it, and they chased the old, not so old, but the provisional government out, and the Kerensky, who was the leader of that, sneaked out of Petrograd dressed up as a woman, and Lenin, Bolshevik Party, took state power, and he was in alliance with other political forces at that time, less social revolutionaries, peasant parties, anarchists, various other forces, who for a temporary time united with the Bolsheviks for the revolution. And then, as you know, there was a long civil war, and the Bolshevik Party emerged successful from that. The Russian people defeated 14 imperialist countries, including Canada, which went to Vladivostok to join these other imperialists, the United States, Japan, and others on the Pacific side, and then many countries of Europe on the European side, who invaded Russia at the time of her weakness, and the Soviet people emerged successfully, and they started to build socialism.
Some critics of socialism argue that attempts have been failures or have lapsed into forms of dictatorial authoritarianism. How do you respond to those criticisms?
Well, they're not criticism so much as observations. I mean, you can look what happened in the Soviet Union. What happened in the Soviet Union. If you're fair-minded, if you're a fair-minded student of history, you can see that the dictatorship of the proletariat that was established in the Soviet Union was also, at the same time, a broad democratic front of workers and peasants to build the nation. The construction of the early stages of socialism in the Soviet Union, let us say from the end of the Civil War, 1922, through the hunger, through the isolation, pulled itself up by its own bootstraps with huge sacrifice. And they built modern industry, they built hydroelectric dams, they built a machine tool industry, which they never had before, and most importantly, they waged a second revolution in the 1930s for collective agriculture. Now, my friend, that is not a minor thing, and it's often very badly distorted, because in order to build socialism, you need an agriculture that can feed your own people, and you need an industry that can feed agriculture with modern implements of agriculture, tractors and harrows and all the modern implements for a modern agriculture. Those pieces were put in place with great sacrifice, with great effort, and you can say with a harsh hand, but they did it. And what did that mean? And they created a new intelligentsia, by the way, as well, engineers, scientists, and so on. But there was a sharp class struggle, and they were surrounded by imperialists, and especially Germany was doing its best to undermine it, and so on. So anyhow, by the time, and there's a whole story about their foreign relations and the rise of Hitler and the United States of America and Western European powers propping Hitler up, financing the Nazi Party, setting it to the east to destroy the Bolsheviks. All of that history is very important to review objectively and soberly. But when push came to shove, who led the war against Nazi fascism? Soviet Union, headed by J.V. Stalin, this people everybody loved to throw bricks at and curse and call a brutal dictator and all of the rest. The fact is, my parents' generation were victorious in a united front against Nazi fascism in Europe and in Japan. And that united front consisted of Soviet Union, British imperialism, U.S. imperialism against Nazi fascism in Europe, Mussolini, Hitler, and Tojo and Japan. And Soviet Union fought on both fronts. They were victorious in Europe. They fought the Nazis for 4 years by themselves. They lost over 20 million people. There are arguments about how many people they lost, but whatever. Millions, rivers of blood were shed to defeat this monster. And then they had volunteered with Churchill and Truman at that time, because Roosevelt had died, to tackle the Japanese in China 3 months after the victory over fascism in Europe. And true to their word, on August the 9th, they launched a major Soviet Army, Red Army assault on Japan in China, where the majority of the Japanese army was staged, as a matter of fact. Now, you know, the Hiroshima bomb was dropped on August 6th, Nagasaki bomb was dropped on August 9th. These bombs were not aimed at Japan so much as aimed for the Soviet Union. It was a kickoff of the Cold War. But yes, now, okay, you want me to explain to you why I think the Soviet Union bit the dust? I can tell you why I think it bit the dust. It bit the dust because after Stalin died or was murdered, there's a lot of speculation that he may have been assassinated by these Khrushchevites and others. Those who succeeded him had no theory about how to build socialism further. What was missing in the Soviet Union, what needed to be built by the next generation of revolutionaries, was real empowerment of the working class, real politicization of the class, and the needs of the entire society. That's a very complicated task. You need to balance those things, because an individual has rights within a collective, a working collective, because modern society, right? We're living in a factory society, an industrial society. So you look in Canada, there's no workplace that isn't collective, basically, unless you're a trapper on your own up in the north, or you're a fisherman on a small boat or something. But everybody, generally speaking, in their workplace is in some form of collective, like a factory. And so you know, collectives are part of the economy and the society, and individuals are part of the collective, and there needs to be a balance established, and that requires new forms and levels of democracy, which were not developed in the Soviet Union. That did not happen. Instead, Khrushchev turned the ship 180 degrees around, became an imperialist power, became a big shot. And, you know, for example, the Warsaw Pact was established in 1954, a year after Stalin died. Stalin wasn't in favor of the Warsaw Pact. He wasn't in favor of militarizing the Soviet Union. In fact, the last crack he had at advancing the development of socialism was in the Congress in 1952. And what did he advocate? He advocated spending 8 billion rubles on refurbishing the agriculture of the Soviet Union with new machines, with new agricultural implements. He said they're worn out. He said we need to supply agriculture. We need to build green belts. He had lots of ideas about building, and they weren't about militarizing the country. His argument was always against militarism. He was always advocating peaceful relations, even with imperialist states, because he said socialism can only defend itself when the people are convinced that socialism is their society, is worth fighting for, is worth sacrificing your life for. And so he thought that the best defense of a socialist Soviet Union, or a socialist any country, was to make life better for the people, to build its social programs, to build its economy, and so on. But that required moving ahead on the front of political empowerment of the working class, the peasantry, the intellectuals, and so on. And that did not happen. And then, so where did Khrushchev's Soviet Union go to? With Brezhnev, then they invaded God knows how many places. They went to Czechoslovakia, they sent the army into Afghanistan, they behaved like a big power, just like the United States of America. Reagan engaged them in a Cold War arms race, and they ran the Soviet Union to the ground. And then they collapsed. And then that character Gorbachev, he said, "Oh well, Reagan promised me he wouldn't put NATO on the borders of the Soviet Union." Well, good luck. Watch that Netflix movie, House of Cards. You want to make deals with those kind of people? You got to be idiot. You got to be an idiot. You want to believe those Hillary Clintons and Reagans and these kind of criminals? They're Nazis. They're fascists. And they intend to take over the whole world, my friends. So, gird your loins and get real here. We are in a life and death struggle for humanity. We are in a life and death struggle for Mother Earth. And our allies are the indigenous peoples. Our allies are the workers of all countries. Our allies are our own courage. And Canadians have good habits, and they have some bad habits. And one of the bad habits is to say sorry every 2 minutes. Why are we sorry? We're not sorry. We want to affirm ourselves as a fighting people, which we have a history of fighting for good things, and we should persist in fighting for justice against Bill C-51, for an anti-war government, for increase of social money to social programs, and against the paying the rich and all of this stuff, and against war. For these are the. So this is what we need to do. This is Marxism, and you can say in a manner of speaking, for the present day. You see, you use the word democracy like Hillary Clinton uses it, and like Trudeau uses it, which is actually a vulgarization of democracy. Those people are not Democrats, and our electoral system is not democratic. It's a mechanism of the financial oligarchs, of the billionaires, of the very, very rich, who have considerable experience of using this fraud of democratic process, which is not democratic in the least. It's party-dominated. These parties that are financed by the big capitalists or the labor aristocracy in one way or another are the gatekeepers to keep the working class and people out of power. So what we analyzed is this. We need a renewal of democracy whereby citizens in their basic political constituency, which is places at work, neighborhoods, seniors' homes, universities, gathering, places where the students live and gather, those real bodies of persons with a political basis need to select their own candidates. And parties should not have that power. The electoral system should both empower the citizens to select the candidates, as well as give all candidates a level playing field and make themselves known and their politics known, so that the people can elect candidates to the National Assembly of some sort. And then we need a new constitution, because how can indigenous people participate in this god-awful colonial affair that was rigged up back in 1867? This is terrible. How can the French-Canadian nation breathe comfortably in an old colonial constitution? They can't. And so new arrangements have to be built and made. And who's going to make those? The bloody oligarchs? Trudeau and his little groupie high-tech interviews with, forums with the rich and the powerful. This is all fraudulent stuff, man. And we need to be creative. When the capitalist class came into being, in the 17th century, 15th century, 16th century, whatever, and the French Revolution and so on, they were inventive. They created new political institutions to suit their class interests against the medieval lords. And they fought revolutions. They bloody fought for their class interests. Well, do we have to do anything less? The modern working class, modern people have to create new political institutions. And one of those institutions are mass democratic groups in the neighborhoods, at the workplaces, and find out what the hell is going on in Parliament. That's why we print a paper called Renewal Update. And you can go on our website at cpcml.ca. I strongly recommend everybody do that. cpcml.ca. And read Renewal Update. We are following what Trudeau and the Liberal Party are doing on a day-to-day basis. We are extremely political. And we want our fellow Canadians to be political. Get those damn things out of your ears when you're, your little ding, 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 ding things that are, or, just going to sports or sex or whatever the bloody diversions are. Get involved. Start thinking about things. Tear the mask off your eyes and see the dangers we are in. We are in really dangerous territory. Watch Netflix and watch that god-awful series called House of Cards, and you see what we're up against. These people are cold-blooded fascists, and they will do anything in their in the name of pragmatism, to put their power everywhere around the world. And this is a huge danger. Well, listen, my friend, if you don't know what the problems of capitalism are, I can't help you. Really. They're all around you. And the world has never been in such a crisis as the world is today. And the weight of the problems are so heavy on the shoulders of the young generation that I plan to stick around for as many years as I can to help out, because it's dark times, my friend. We are in a period which we call retreat of revolution, or you could say it in another way, retrogression of society into barbarism. So that's enough to say about what's wrong with capitalism today, I think.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.